So let's start the discussion. I would ask you to introduce yourself in some sentences and give a short overview of your involvement with open source software.
Thank you. My name is Christoph Walcher. I'm working for a web agency. The name is Diamond Dogs. That is the name of David Bowie album. My involvement in open source software is more or less that the user perspective. I had a short career as bug fixing code monkey in the Subsonic project.
Yeah, I'm Stefan Wenig. We already met, I think. I'm working for Rubicon, which is named after a river. No exciting album or something. We have a long history of open source. Of course, we used a lot of open source software. You know, back in the days when Microsoft didn't provide all the tooling and everything that was necessary. We started with, like everyone else, with a unit and it all got on from there. And then we started to publish our own software as open source. First a framework, then a major product, and we regularly publish new open source projects which we develop with interns and in the course of master thesis with students that work at our site. Yeah, that's basically it.
I'm Sebastien, hi again. My involvement in open source, I've had two projects. One of them was very successful, the other one made a lot of noise and was less successful. Open Rust and Open Wrap, and I assume I'll be the Microsoft can be evil voice in this conversation.
I'm Oren. My first open source project was Rhinomox in 2004. Since then there was in Hibernate, Rhino Security, Rhino Commons, Rhino DHT, Rhino Service Bus, a lot of Rhinos basically. Right now I'm working on RavenDB, which is also an open source project, and that's it.
Okay, thank you. Microsoft has long been perceived as an anti-open software company. And do you think have to change their attitude? And if yes, in which way?
I think the things got a little bit better. It's not that the copycat attitude like with NUnit. Microsoft builds their own testing framework. I think things get better.
Okay, thank you. So maybe I give it to you. It will be quite interesting.
I have a certain perspective on Microsoft. Microsoft is, you can look at Microsoft two ways. You can look at Microsoft as a global entity, and then you need to judge the company with all the things they do. Or you can judge the various groups within Microsoft. I think certain groups in Microsoft are starting to get it. I think some groups are starting to understand that their job is not just to recreate what other people were already successful doing, and that they could innovate by joining projects. The recent example is the Git TF, Git Foundation server integration that Microsoft is building. They went to the original project that was doing that, discussed with them, saw if they could work together, decided in common agreements that they wouldn't, and they went and built their own. I commend that for that. It's a great way. I have been in the opposite direction, where I built a package manager, and a couple of months later Microsoft announced that they've been building a package manager as well. So I'm the divorcee in the couple in that one. At that point it was not probably the right thing to do. The landscape would have been very different if they had outreached and integrated. But that team didn't feel they could do that for whichever reason they had. So is it getting better? Yes, I think certain groups are getting better, but there is no culture of open source in Microsoft, and that's, I think, what my problem is with it. The Windows team is not or doesn't seem to be very friendly towards open source. The developer tools team is more and more friendly with open source. Everything is open source that they seem to be doing recently, all the frameworks, MVC, etc. They all open source now. Even the entity framework is open source.
Do you think it's a real
And no, we not fix bugs though.
Do you think it's a real movement in some certain groups in Microsoft, or is it more a movement to make the loud open source people a little bit friendlier to Microsoft? Is it a real movement, or is it just a way to keep them friendly?
My personal opinion is that Microsoft, as a company, only cares where they make money, and building the entity framework and MVC doesn't generate a lot of cash. So, well, the server division sells licenses. So,
Just some background here that is important to understand. For a very long time, DevDiv, the development division in Microsoft, wasn't considered to be revenue-generating division. Its purpose was, we are here to create great tools for the Microsoft platforms, so people will use Microsoft platforms. And the revenue that generated was indirect. Sometimes ago it was changed. I think it was a mistake, but I'm not Bill Gates, so no one cares what I think. But what is important to understand that coming out with something like MVC is absolutely important to the bottom line of Microsoft. If they haven't come up with ASP.NET MVC, more people would have moved to Rails. If they move to Rails, they're going to run on Linux. If they're going to run on Linux, Microsoft is going to get Zlitz. So that is something that is very, very important to understand. Entity framework, for example, you could be very sure that every time someone uses entity framework, they're actually going to be talking to SQL Server. There is a one-to-one association there, and they're making tons and tons of money on that. The licensing prices for SQL Server are obscene.
just
That was certainly a major customer that they had in mind when they built it, yes. And if you want, I would happily sit with you over a beer and give you my take on how and why the entity framework was built the way it was built. I will just say that when they came out with that, they very explicitly said, this is not an object relational mapper. This is not an object relational mapper. This is not an object relational mapper. So take them at their word. When it came out, it wasn't an ORM. It wasn't meant to be an ORM. It was meant to be an integration tool.
Just to go back to the previous point, completely agree on the points that Oren made about making the platform competitive. I think the important question really is, would they have had the same leverage by integrating themselves with existing communities in the open source movement and provide IDE support, strong IDE support for something like monorails and provide their testing support? They could have done that.
As someone who is involved in many open source projects, the one thing that Microsoft could do that would endear them to my heart, if they put someone full-time on a project, they would have tremendous amount of influence. Because in any open source project that I've seen, the major factor was how much time people in the community could put into that. I'm running a commercial open source project, so RavenDB, we pay for RavenDB on our pocket, and it makes the whole difference in the world when you have someone who's actually spending 8 or 9 hours a day working that day in and day out, what you can do, how you can do, all those sort of things. And if Microsoft would have put, I think that if Microsoft would have put, let's say, the monorail project, for example, if they put someone there, okay, here are the things that we need to be able to integrate with Visual Studio to support this or that enterprise scenario, I'm almost certain, and I'm actually a member of the, was a member of the custom monorail project, it would have been gladly accepted. And I can't think of many open source projects that would say no if someone basically told them, we need to put people on the project to do work for the project.
Okay, thank you. So do you think that Microsoft supports the community?
I think they're trying. There are forces within Microsoft that are definitely trying, but it's always a more or less individual effort. What happened to Scott Guthrie? I mean, he's one of the guys I think who got it, yeah. And now he's working on. Exactly. So that's what happens. There is no open source strategy from the top. It's not like Steve Ballmer is going to bed and wondering what is going to do with open source in our ecosystem. I mean, he's worrying about Linux and all that stuff, of course.
Yeah, they have. Microsoft has multiple strategies. Now it's interesting because I asked that question to Steve Ballmer last year. I said, "What is the strategy at Microsoft across divisions for open source software?" To which he replied with a backflip, going, "That's a very interesting question. I do not have an answer for you. I will send you an email." Steve, if you see us, I'm still waiting for the email. But Microsoft does have not one strategy, they've got multiple strategies. They have the Outer Curve Foundation, that's where they dump the codes they want to publish in open source on a completely separate entity that is funded by Microsoft. They also created a Microsoft open source commercial company that I'm not exactly sure how it fits with the rest of the process, which I think is more attached to the Windows division than the Outer Curve Foundation, which is more with the developer division. How all that fits together, I'm not sure. Is there a strategy? I really don't think there is. I think they're throwing external entities so that they can stop having to deal with open source within the company.
Looking at the history of Microsoft and open source, it was 5-6 years ago that it was common knowledge that Microsoft employees should not be even looking at open source projects. And maybe it was 7 or 8, but that was about it. And then they came out with shared source licensing, which basically means if you sign this stack of papers, we let you pick at our source code. And then now it's actually part of Visual Studio. You can go and debug through the framework code. And now then they have okay, we're going to actually release stuff as under an open source project, but under an open source OSI approved license, but we're not going to take contributions back. And now we have major projects, the AT framework, the Web API, the MVC, all of them are actually non-trivial projects from the point of view of Microsoft, and they are now, or at least some of them are accepting external contributions. And I think that if you look from where we were 5 or 10 years ago, that is dramatic difference. I'm still waiting to the day when an external project would be integrated into the Microsoft stack, but something like that happened with jQuery. And I want to see more of that. I want to see that not only at the absolute, sorry? SignalR is developed by Microsoft employees.
Yes, but it was a private project that they developed.
Which is a Microsoft employee. So there is a difference between developers on their free time doing stuff which get rolled up in. For example, Gmail was a 20% project at Google. So there is a difference between having a totally different project come out and they adopt that, okay, this is what we're going to push. There is also, I think, another problem is that I think they're afraid of having to make decisions. So if they choose a unit testing framework, why did you choose this one and not this one, and so those sort of things. I think that the decision to build their own in some cases was insane, but I can follow the chain of logic that they had.
Just to finish my point on the community, because you were talking about community, I think Microsoft, for me, will be a no evil company the day where they join other communities more often than they try to create new ones. Microsoft is good at creating new communities out of the blue with new projects. They are not very good at joining groups. If we look at what happened with jQuery, yes, they're shipping it with a framework, yes, they are supporting it, but the code that was supposed to come from Microsoft and join the jQuery project never quite materialized. The jQuery template stuff is still not anywhere complete and has been pushed away from the release, etc. There's been a lot of changes. So Microsoft is having a very painful time integrating itself with other communities. It's knowledge they don't have. They don't know how to do it because they've always been closed off from the rest of the world with communities they created completely independently. So I think that's the change that we're seeing now, and I hope that it's going to work well. But that's definitely, from the community side of things, not something they're good at right now.
But I think the discussion is going a little bit in the wrong direction, because we always talk about how Microsoft can support an open source community, and I think an open source community is only vital if the open source community works and does the stuff on its own. So it's us that that have to build the community to make open source things.
I think we're still suffering from many problems that occurred in the past. If you look at how Microsoft treated open source in the beginning, when they were starting to fight Linux and everything, they pretty much drove everybody away who was invested in open source. And now the community that is left is basically people who can live with Microsoft, which kind of reduces the input of possible community members. And from here on, there's like you said, it's not like Microsoft can fix anything. If you look at the Java world, for instance, who here knows enterprise Java beans? Okay, who likes it? Yeah, it got better, and the reason it got better, everybody hated it when it was in version 1, version 2. Everybody hated it, and exactly. And the reason it's not that bad is that somebody came and made Spring. And when the Spring framework, which was totally open source, was invented, then eventually someone had to react and improve enterprise Java beans. And it's yeah.
Look at what happened with the EG stuff. So you're talking about that, but look at what happened with Hibernate in Java world, when they came out with the Java persistent. Sorry. Yeah, the JPA standard, which was basically sort of like, this is what an Hibernate is, except with all sorts of subtle differences, just to make my life harder. Because there is some other ORMs like one from Oracle that I called, sorry? Toplink, yes. And other stuff like that they wanted to put their own signature on that. And I'm not sure how good that is, because that thing actually took up a whole release for the Hibernate team.
I think there's a detailed problem on the Java world. I mean, the head honcho from Hibernate, what was his name? I forgot it. He joined the Enterprise Java Beans specification team, so I think they pretty much get along pretty well. So whatever mistakes they made, there was a movement within the Java world. They thought they could do better. They made an open source project, and the Java world changed. And it was either some would change, or the community would adopt Spring altogether and just throw EJB out the window. And this doesn't happen in the .NET world. If you look at stuff like monorail or something, do you think Microsoft, when they made MVC, were they reacting to monorail, or were they reacting to other platforms that stole their developers? You think so? Ruby Rails or monorail? You're talking about Ruby on Rails or mono? Yeah, exactly. So they didn't really care whether, you know, some community in the .NET ecosystem makes something better, but it wasn't the thing that really drove them. It was outside competition. It was other platforms that attacked their market, that threatened to take away their market share.
Look at the hardware development board, and you can see that it's from version 1 to version 15, whatever we are now, they adapted more and more. So Entity Framework adapted more and more to what Hibernate is doing because of pressure from the community, because they had to match what was the standard on the .NET ORMs, which was Hibernate.
And don't forget that Web API, which is the latest work from the WCF team, would not exist, and I will take a very bold statement, would not exist if Open Raster didn't do this stuff 4 years ago, and if the service stack didn't exist. Because we're the ones that pushed for standard compliant HTTP stacks, and the reason why they reacted is because WCF REST was such a horrible, horrible product, and that everybody just moved towards open source solutions. That's why they reacted to rebuild it, because the previous one was crap and there was competitive pressure. And I think that's the value where, that's one of the difficulties with dealing with Microsoft when it comes to open source. They need the open source sweat being built into software to provide them competition, because there is no other big vendor that is going to attack them frontally. There's a few, but very few. Without that competition, they can stagnate very easily into building.
Do you think this will change in the future? Or in the near future, let's say in the next 5 years, so that Microsoft is more open to open source projects and adapting this constant?
I think they're going to have to, for one reason. If they keep on trying to compete with open source projects as opposed to integrate them, and they piss off developers that spend hundreds and hundreds of hours and years on projects, and they fuck off on other platforms, pardon my French, there's going to be no one left. And the previous strategy of just employing everybody at Microsoft that came from the open source projects they were building has kind of run dry because people have left now. And a lot of people have left to other platforms because they didn't feel that Microsoft was integrating with their work properly. So I think there is going to be a need, because at some point the balance is going to be skewed completely, and you're going to be left with a few projects that run in niche markets that Microsoft is not interested in pursuing. And I don't think we'll have a healthy ecosystem until we are able to have open source projects that are on main component and not just on niche markets, without fear of Microsoft jumping in and stepping on toes, as they described it to me once.
I actually don't agree with that. Most probably because I actually had the experience of being in a team when Microsoft released an Hibernate killer, which was Entity Framework 1.0. And the reaction that I had at the time was, okay, now basically no one is going to use an Hibernate. And as we have seen throughout the day, a lot of people still do. And the major thing that you have to understand about Microsoft, they are a big company, and culturally speaking, they move very slowly. That means as an open source project competing with Microsoft, I have a huge advantage just because I'm much more agile. If I'm looking at Entity Framework, it means that Entity Framework took, I think, 2 or 3 releases just to get to the point where they could support enums, which is insane, I think. Whereas with an Hibernate, if there wasn't support for enums, you could have it in the next build and have it shipped within a range of 6 months top. With Microsoft, it was, okay, yeah, that's a very good suggestion. We'll add it to the list to be considered for not the next version that is going to come out, the one after that. So with a release cycle of 18 months, you're talking about 3 years from now. I don't know whatever that feature would be good for me in 3 years. I know it will be irrelevant because I'm not just going to sit here and wait for that feature to come. And in 3 years, I'm going to be on another project doing something else. So that ability to actually respond in time. So one thing that we do with RavenDB a lot is someone comes up with a problem and I tell them it's fixed, please wait 5 minutes and then you can have the updated build. And versus, again, 18-month chip time. They have several.
Yes, they have one, but they couldn't build a document store because they know a document store would have to compete with RavenDB, and RavenDB will always be much more agile. So I think that's the reason they haven't done it yet.
I think for enterprise things, it really doesn't matter if you have the features or anything else. You have the contract with support, you have the install packages, and it's Microsoft and it's maintained.
Except for the likes of them, we have all that.
I have a theory about that. I think if Microsoft would build something like that, they would have more competition between SQL Server and their own product, which would have to be much cheaper than SQL Server, than competition between SQL Server and RavenDB. Yeah. So they probably just don't want to have this in this price scale, and they can't charge these amounts for a document database, but they can build NoSQL features into SQL Server and still charge their incredible amounts. So that makes pretty much business sense.
There is an excellent book which is called In Search of Stupidity. And I highly recommend it for anyone. It's a marketing book, and it talks about marketing disasters in the tech world for, let's say, from the 80s to the 2000s. And he talks about actually just this thing when you have two products from the same company which compete with one another. And the classic example would be Windows 95 and Windows NT. How the hell are you supposed to explain to someone, you should go to this one or this one, and you have two marketing departments actually competing with one another for the same set of customers. So that makes a lot of sense.
That's in the DNA of the company, though. Since the beginning of Microsoft, the conflicts between competing teams that build the same thing are part of Microsoft. That's how they build software. There's a quote that you can check from Steve Ballmer somewhere that says that that's what Bill Gates brought to the company, show that conflict was positive for product development. For those of you that remember Link to SQL with the entity framework, and there were many other of these projects that existed, it's a common thing within Microsoft. So I think actually cannibalizing each other's not on the cash cows. No, Sinofsky is not exactly in the same mood about Windows, which is why we don't have Silverlight anymore.
Yeah, I think another question is how everybody of us can, what everybody of us can do to improve the situation.
I think clone some open source project, add the feature, and make a first push request. That's the start.
I think it starts with using. Problem in the Microsoft ecosystem is that many people, I mean the majority is enterprise developers, right? It's not people building products, it's enterprise developers, and these people are often very very Microsoft minded, so they just, they look into the MSDN journal or on the Microsoft official blog and see what's new. And it isn't like Microsoft is going there and saying, hey, look at all these cool open source projects, they make our platform so much better. It's there? I haven't actually. I should actually try to read this again. It's been some time, yeah. Yeah. And how did everything? Okay, but still, it's not like the .NET community will pick these things up like the Java community, for instance, is it? There is still a lot of difference there. I mean, in the Java community, it's just natural to pick up some open source stuff. There are large communities with any number of users.
And at the same time, one of the problems with the Java community is the balkanization of software. We have 60 different login frameworks. And then you actually have to have an Uber login framework, the common login, just to be able to do that. And there is another common login framework out there, which competes with the same common login framework. And then you just go crazy. So I don't know if that's a good thing. You can see it, for example, you talked today about REST services and Simple Web and OpenRasta and Service Stack and all of those. And you see you have 5, 10 of those projects, and you usually have 2 or 3 that are the major ones. And at that point, you tend to see some consolidation of features and approach until one of them becomes the major one, and then there is a period and there are contenders, blah, blah, blah. But I don't know, looking at the stats in Olo, in GitHub or something like that, I see tons and tons of .NET projects. They range from the horrible example that I showed earlier today to really, really useful stuff. And then you have to ask yourself, okay, what sort of things do you do in open source? And you have things that build infrastructure and build framework, and then you have the people who build the interesting stuff, the applications. There is an open source dental health management system for dentists, so you can manage a dental office with that, and in .NET. So those are the things that I think when you get to that point, I think that you can say that there isn't a significant presence in .NET of open source developers. And I think that it impacts everything. Go and look at the schedule of any conference, including Microsoft sponsored the Microsoft run conferences, and I think you will see some significant percentage there spent talking about open source stuff.
You're pretty satisfied with the situation?
Satisfied, I'm not sure. I still want to get to the point where it's not just the community that accepts open source. I wanted to get to the point where it's as standard to use open source as it is in the Java world. Because in the Java world, I want to use Spring. Well, of course you want to use Spring. We won't let you use anything else. And in the .NET world, it can be hard. I want to use RavenDB. We already have SQL Server. What's the point? And stuff like that.
I'll add one more point on that. And you were talking about the balkanization of software. It may be the case in the Java world. From what I've seen of the Node community so far, people are a bit less centered on promoting their names when they build open source, in the sense that when you try to find something that does what you want, you go and search in a package manager, see if it exists. If it exists, you use it until such a time as it doesn't work anymore. When it doesn't work for what you want anymore, you send a pull request. If that gets refused, you may fork and create your own project, or just create new if you don't find it originally. In the Microsoft world, in the open source world, there has been a lot of reinventing the wheel. And when I say a lot, I do mean a lot. Where people said, I cannot make this framework work for me because I have a different idea. Now, you may or may not be able to integrate with the original project, but there's plenty of libraries that probably already do what you do. And the reflex of improving on the existing and reusing the existing as opposed to rebuild, right now in the .NET world, is much more balanced on the reinvent my own solution. And I think that that's part of the problem. We have a small community of open source developers that split themselves a lot by having low level of reuse. I think it all stems down from the fact that we didn't have a package manager until 2 years ago. Now we've got 1.00001, with the 1 being NuGet. And that's changing slowly. But right now the pull requests don't come in flowing for old projects. And I think the community is changing because projects like Nancy framework are getting a lot more community involvement and action. But if you look at when we started OpenRaster 5 years ago, there was none. And I still don't get pull requests. So version 2 is still exactly what it was 3 years ago. Right? So I think the community is changing, but the habits are still quite bad. We're getting there, but it's going to take a while. Yes, I agree with you. I agree with you. GitHub makes it much easier, but I also think the community is larger and people are getting more interaction with the original developers through tools like GitHub. But I will say that OpenRaster moved to GitHub 2 years ago, and the number of pull requests I can count on my hand. So either I build a perfect framework to start with, or people just for old projects have a lot of difficulty going back and revisiting it. Or the code is shit, I don't know.
Let me ask you this. How many questions do you get on an average on mailing list, on general Just what is the level of activity? Okay, the reason I'm saying that one of the things that we did with RavenDB almost from the get-go was try to explicitly build their community by saying that's a great suggestion. Please send me pull requests for that, and encourage that very hard. And some of our most awesome features, facets, dynamic queries, those sort of things actually came from the community, from people who says, "Oh, I need that. I'm going to build that," and it was done. And by making it the default approach for many things, I think it's also a matter of the gen of the project, the culture of the project.
Yeah, I think at the time when OpenRasa was built, I managed it as a product. And so I took feature requests and I built them myself most of the time. So people felt no need to build their own code. And I think that stayed in that community where the biggest users are doing commits but never send pull requests. So I think that's absolutely fundamental. And that's what I will never do again in any of my projects.
So, okay, yeah, okay.
Just to get back to your initial question, I think everybody should just sit back for a second and think about what can be in it for me. And of course, if you have a problem, you just look around for a solution, and the stuff is you don't care if it's open source or if it's something else, if it solves your problem. But the interesting thing about open source is, of course, you can influence the way it goes. If you have a small problem, you can provide a fix. And if you start providing a fix or taking part in the community some other way, it starts getting interesting because you're suddenly working on a project which doesn't solve some absurd business problem of some customer who doesn't know right from left, but you get to do some infrastructure, some technical stuff that's usually not on your daily menu, and you don't have to start a whole project that doesn't have the business value to support it. It's just, you can just play a little bit with it, and this works pretty good for some people. And if you do it in the right spots, you can actually improve your project in a way that you couldn't by working around something, some blob from Microsoft that you cannot change. You just put in a fix at the right spot, and it could work wonders. So I think it's something that everybody should try at some point to just subscribe to some developer lists and some open source projects, see what's going on, and see if there's something that they can contribute if need be.
So thank you for the closing words. We are out of time, and I think the shuttle bus are waiting for the after show party. So let's pop some bottles.